Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished entrepreneur from Mumbai, India, Mr. S Swaminathan. Swami, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ashutosh. Thanks for inviting me to your show, and it's a privilege talking to you.
Thank you. Swami is the founder and partner of ContraMinds Labs, which is focused on decoding people, minds, strategy, and culture. So, Swami, before we talk about ContraMinds, tell me about your own amazing journey in brief.
Great. So, Ashutosh, my own journey after my engineering and management degree, I joined an engineering firm, Crompton Greaves, way back in 90. And as I did the management training program in Crompton Greaves, there was a creative bent of my mind that I saw for myself. And that's when I joined McCann Erickson, which is an advertising agency out of Delhi.
Yeah.
And then I moved to Contract, which is a JWT, WPP company. In the advertising business, I really focused on CRM, database marketing, loyalty marketing. And those are the kind of work that I did. And as I did this in this journey, one thing I realized was marketing was actually getting transformed, into data-driven marketing, and with technology getting at its core in 2006, 2007.
Yep.
And that's when I went out and set up my own analytics and MarTech firm called Sequity. And the whole idea was really to fuse technology with creativity. And we were the first company to really merge creativity and MarTech way back in 2007, along with analytics and data. And finally, I sold the company, and now I run ContraMinds Labs.
Fantastic.
So the whole idea really was for the first 15 years of my life, I was actually using the right brain thinking, and the left brain thinking was for the next 15 years.
Amazing.
And what I realized is you need the whole brain thinking to build any particular brand or a customer strategy.
Very well said. Very well said. So, we're going to talk about three different aspects of ContraMinds Labs today. One is decoding people, second is strategy, and third is culture. So let's start with decoding people. My first question for you, Swami, is how do you approach the challenge of decoding the minds of customers to create better marketing strategies?
So this is something that Ashutosh, I think I learned when I was in advertising, right? Where we were given challenges, which were, for different categories. It could be a bank, it could be a retail company, it could be a software company, and that's really where my learning around how to decode how customers think, how do they buy, and how do they engage with brands. That's something really what I learned in my advertising business, because it was largely around observation, right? So typically when you're an engineer, what I realized was I was a very rational professional, right? You have flow charts and you basically, say yes and no, and that's really how the do loops work.
Yeah.
But when you really look at consumers are, I would say, irrational in their decision, and therefore you need a strong sense of observation. And therefore, one thing that I learned was, be in the market, observe customers, get into the skin of the consumer. And that's really when you start to understand and decode customers. And that's really how I believe we can decode customers and their behavior.
Oh, fascinating. And what would you say are some key psychological principles that you believe every business leader should be able to understand if they're going to talk about decoding people?
Yeah. So this is something that I'm extremely passionate about, Ashutosh, because being a professional and then after I became an entrepreneur, there's a very, very big difference in the reason why you do what you do every day, right? There is a job and there is a career, right? A job is what you do because you want to earn something and then ensure that your livelihood is made. But a career is something that you have to be an expert at, right? And that is beyond the job that you do, right?
Mm.
So as a business leader, the first thing that I would say is, what's the purpose which you need to put forward, and therefore do you have a purpose in what you're doing? So I
Right.
call that as the first pillar of being a business leader.
Mm.
The second one really is, do you have the mindset, okay, to achieve that purpose, right? Because typically the mindset requires you to do things consistently. You may not get the results that you actually planned for. You need to keep tweaking as you go along. So the mindset then becomes important.
Mm.
And the third thing is really the practice, right? Which is really, once I know what's my purpose, once I have the right mindset, then you then go back and say, what's the practice I need to do every day to achieve my purpose? So I would say purpose, mindset, and practice, only if they are aligned, can
Mm.
you be a leader of repute and excellence.
What a great response. Thank you. And how would you balance intuition and data when making decisions about people and culture?
So this is something that when I did my entrepreneurship in Sequity,
Mm.
we used to have hosts of loads and loads of data.
Mm.
Okay, and when you saw loads and loads of data, typically what would happen is you then start to really use machine learning. You use algorithms and models, but as you look at data. Then suddenly you have to go back and then say data doesn't tell you the whole story, right? You have to then go back and then say what is behind this data, right?
Right.
Which is really to say, okay, somebody in retail, for example, keeps buying, say, organic, okay,
Mm.
food. Then the thing is, it just tells me that they buy organic food, which is what the data is saying.
Mm.
The mindset behind this buying organic kind of food and stuff that they are buying means that they are actually having a certain lifestyle and a certain purpose with which they want to support certain products,
Mm.
right? So
Mm.
therefore the ability to understand the psychology, okay, behind what people purchase is really where I think you really have to fuse data with the behavior of people, and therefore your intuition is just not I would say algorithms, but you need to add soul to data. That's when you can actually get intuition.
Very well said. And would you be also be able to talk a little bit to me about the importance of cultural intelligence in today's global business environment?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and it's a great question, Ashutosh. Especially in this world where there are markets, even in India, for example. What you see in the north is really not what you see in the south. The
Right.
value systems and the behaviors are very, very different,
Correct.
and therefore, what you consider value, okay, in one part of the world is really probably very different from what you see in other part of the world. And when we handle global brands, this cultural intelligence was very, very important because you had to understand why people buy and why people do certain things the way they do. Okay. Then when you interact with clients, sometimes the way Japanese would react to me would be very different from the way the Americans would interact and the
Right.
way Europeans would interact, because sometimes they may say yes when they want to say no.
Mm.
Okay. And therefore, the understanding of culture and the way they actually decode decision making,
Mm.
okay, and how they handle conflict and feedback is something that you've got to be extremely cognizant about. And
Mm.
that's really where I think cultural intelligence plays a very important role for a business leader, because you then have to look at the people who you interact with, the customers who you interact with, what markets do they come from, what's really the background they come from. And
Mm.
that's really where the core of cultural intelligence starts to actually play a huge part in how you really decode, understand, and therefore apply your decisions.
Very well said. And what role, in your opinion, does empathy play in leadership and business strategy?
I personally think, Ashutosh, that it plays a huge, huge role, especially when you have to be empathetic. At the same time, you got to be a straight shooter if you're a business leader, right? So
Mhm.
therefore, I always have seen that when you actually bring in empathy, it brings in a certain set of soft skills that you need to develop. Okay.
Mhm.
And these soft skills are around how do you influence, how do you nudge people, how do you ensure that you're articulate to clarify your strategy, clarify the purpose with which people are doing something. There, the need for empathy becomes very important because many a times, what you really want people to do, they may not really have an understanding of why you are asking me to do it.
Mhm.
Therefore, the fact that you got to be a keen observer of how the body language with which they react to your decisions, the way they interpret what you say, uh,
Mhm.
how you really absorb certain feedback that you get. That's really where I think empathy plays a huge role because your ability to adapt and understand what people say and don't say is
Mhm.
really where I think empathy makes a big difference for you as a leader.
Mhm. Well said. So now let's move to another major leg of ContraMind Labs, which is strategy. And my first question is, what are the foundational elements of a successful business strategy?
I believe if you really look at the foundation of a strategy, the first is really what I call as, what's the market you want to play with, right? So because, there are different, strata of markets that you may want to play with. So decide which markets you want to play,
Mhm.
decide which customer segments you want to play with.
Mhm.
And the third would be what kind of a business model do you want to build,
Mhm.
right? And today in this digital world, there are business models where you can actually spend money before you get your revenue. Okay, there are business models where you say, okay, I have to probably earn my profit and keep growing. Okay, so therefore the business model is as important as the customer segment and the shred of the market that you want to focus. So I would say these are the three fundamental principles around which the strategy gets built.
Well said. And what would you say are some of the biggest strategic challenges facing companies today?
See, I think as I work with companies and as I work with business leaders, uh, I would say the volatility and the changes that are happening to their own business
Mm.
is really one of the biggest challenges because uh, you know I wouldn't really expect a competitor to come in from a category that I thought was never a competition, right? So, for example, if I'm a automotive brand, for me, is Uber a competitor or not?
Mm.
Okay, is a key question that an automotive brand player needs to actually start looking at. So, therefore, there's a lot of I would say changes that are happening to the ecosystems and the environments in which brands and businesses operate today. I think that's a strategic challenge.
Mm.
The second challenge that I see is really people,
Mm.
right? So therefore, if you really look at probably the early 1950s and the 1980s, the average life of a company, okay, you could say I was 100-year-old company.
Mm.
Okay. Today, the life cycle of a company is probably in the next, say, 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. If imagine if it's only 15 to 20 years or 30 years, but your working life as a
Mm.
professional is going to be probably for 70 years.
Right.
Okay. So therefore, how do you really then motivate people when actually, the life cycle of the professional is far more longer than that of the company,
Right.
right? So that is again a strategic challenge in how you really look at people, how do you motivate them, how do you incentivize them,
Mm.
and therefore you're moving away from the traditional industrialized world, which probably was started in the early 1900s, and I think we are now moving towards information and a knowledge economy where I think the way you deal with business, the way you deal with the decisions that you want to take as a business is completely changing. Therefore, I would say people and business models are really the biggest challenge that I see for businesses.
Mm. Well said. And what would you say is uh, a methodology for strategy
Mhm.
to remain flexible and adaptable to change, especially given the incredible amount of technology
Mhm.
that is now being seen by all of us in every aspect of our life?
See, I personally believe technology is an enabler,
Correct.
and technology is not the sole source of disruption to a strategy, right? So it's basically, I would say, it is the wind beneath the wings, right? So therefore, the first principles of strategy to be flexible and adaptable is being close to the market. Okay. So if you're close to the market, then you're able to sense what are the changes in mindsets, what are the changes in behavior that the society is going through. So therefore, your ability to have a sense of, I would say, understanding of what's happening in the marketplace is very important for you to be adaptable. The second thing that I would say is really looking at how the society and the customers, being close to the customer, is something that is very important. Most often, uh, as you get senior in a in your business, and as businesses get larger, they probably move far away from the customer, right? And therefore, you really don't understand how the customer's life is changing, what's really their pain. And therefore, staying close to the customer is really important, because then you know how you can adapt to the changes that are happening in their lives. Okay, it could be a B2B client, it could be a B2C client, but
Mm.
when you stay close to the customer and when you have a sense of what's happening in the marketplace, then I think your ability to adapt and change, and being humble that your strategy always need not be right, right?
Mm.
And therefore saying that, okay, uh, I need to change it and it's not working, and therefore don't get stuck with it. I think the fixed mindset
Mm.
is really where I see a problem, and therefore your ability to say, I think I took a bet, maybe this is not working, and let me now pivot and do something else
Mm.
to ensure that the customer needs and the market needs are met, is
Mm.
really how you can be adaptable and flexible when it comes to business strategy.
Amazing. Thank you. Now let's move to a third leg of ContraMinds Labs, which is culture. And culture is often spoken about all over the world, but not too many people seem to appreciate or understand it too much. So, therefore, my first question for you, Swami, is what are the key components of a strong organizational culture?
See, I think having worked in MNCs and having been an entrepreneur myself, okay, the first thing that I found in terms of culture, what's important is, do you do what you preach?
Mm.
Okay, it's very easy to put up a poster outside your reception saying that this is the vision, this is
Correct.
really our mission, this is really what we stand for.
Mm.
But what I see in many companies is, do the leaders really walk the talk?
Mm.
Okay, to me, that's the most fundamental
Correct.
in actually building what the culture of the organization is.
Mm.
The second thing is, I believe authenticity, okay, is another important thing, which is actually, I would say, not so prevalent in organizations. So when you actually look at a corporate culture, you say one thing and do another thing,
Mm.
right? So you have very good meetings, you don't express what it means, and what you feel, and therefore ability to have a transparent environment is very important in culture building. The third is completely being brutal and honest,
Mm.
okay, to what is happening uh, to you as a business, and ability to take feedback, okay, and not be defensive about it.
Right.
Say these are very, very important, because as you build culture,
Yeah.
you realize that you live in a moat, okay, and you realize that these are some of the things that you then start to defend yourself.
Mm.
And so when you look at culture, it's about what you do every day, and do you live it every day? And are you willing to actually look in the mirror and then say that this is what I put out, and is this the way I walk the talk?
Very well said. I've spoken to many startup entrepreneurs or many senior corporate leaders, and if I ask them about culture, they say, well, I'm the boss. Everyone else is supposed to do it. It doesn't apply to me. And you've given a fabulous response to that one. But my next question to you, Swami, is what is the role of leadership in shaping and maintaining company culture?
Hmm.
And you've answered it partly already.
Yeah. No, I believe, Ashutosh, that I think you put too much of pressure on leaders to say that they are the I would say the torch bearers of culture. But what I also see is there are people who need to be torch bearers of culture. Okay, so many a times what I find is that as a leader, does your one down and their one down, and then finally the last man standing, okay, or woman standing, right? uh, do they believe in that culture? Because many a times I've seen that the third level and the fourth level people who are there, they actually blame the management, but when actually they look up to themselves and then say, do I live the culture? They probably are not living the culture, right? So therefore I would say, as a leader, your ability to actually I would say get the team glue, okay, around saying this is the culture that we stand for, and showing them the path to say that when it comes to decision making, when you come to value systems, when you come to the work culture, when it comes to how you deal with people, do you look up to the management, or do you actually do it yourself? And do you then actually get the people below you to do what it does? So I think leadership is it's like a pathway and a roadmap, but the flights that land and take off are the people who come in and go in an organization, and they need to hold that culture, and they have as much responsibility, okay, as the leader themselves.
Well said. So time for two more questions. My next question for you is what strategies can a leader use to maintain a positive culture during times of change or crisis? And we've just come out of 3 years of tough situations all over the world.
See, I'm somebody who believes that more than positive culture, I would say positive culture is an outcome of your actions. Okay, so therefore, if your actions are authentic, transparent, and if some of the decisions that you take, okay, are uh, in the interest of people and the organization, the positive culture automatically happens. Right. So let me give you an example. During COVID, when this whole thing fell apart for many businesses, most leaders literally said, okay, now where do I cut costs? Okay, how do I ensure that the business survives? Okay, uh, the question really is, were you able to tell the story that what are you doing yourself as a leader, okay, to ensure that what's the sacrifice that you are doing to ensure that the organization survives, okay, and therefore what are the hard decisions that you are taking yourself and your management team, and how do you tell that story to your people, okay? When you actually are transparent and when you're able to tell that story, I believe a positive culture can happen. So it's important, therefore, how you tell the story and how you ensure that they start having a trust that this is the leader, okay, who also during times of crisis takes hard decisions for their own lives and their own economic fundamentals are being actually taken strong action around. Then probably this whole positive culture then starts to permeate within the organization.
Well said. And my last question to you, Swami, and this is for you. What are your future goals for ContraMinds Labs? And what legacy do you hope to leave behind in the industry?
I'm not so sure, it's such a large company to think of legacy and things like that because it's a startup that, is still getting formed. But one thing, Ashutosh, that, what my work life has taught me is there is a difference between being an employee and being a professional. Okay. So, my question has always been that would you actually go and consult a bad doctor? Okay. You would never go, right? Would you actually go and build a house with a bad architect? Okay. But when you come to an organization, the word professional actually has to mean how do you look at yourself as a doctor
Right.
of strategy. Maybe you are an architect of the organization building, and therefore, how do you build your expertise, okay, to be the best in your profession? Okay, that's really what I think ContraMinds Labs is striving to leave as a legacy. For example, some of the work that I do with decoding how excellence gets built in people, okay, is something that I have conversations, and then I realize that it's a long journey. It's not a short journey. Okay, so therefore, ability to tell people that only by deliberate practice you are able to do it over a long period of time. And I would think that if I was able to change, okay, and leave this, I would say, information and the knowledge with people so that they take it and start to practice it. So imagine you were able to build a string of leaders with a certain amount of commitment, a certain amount of purpose, mindset, and practice. They are able to build it and create inventory of large leaders, then that's the legacy I would like to leave behind.
Wonderful. And on that note, Swami, just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. Thank you for speaking to me about ContraMinds Labs. I think I learned many new things from you when it comes to decoding people, strategy, and culture. You also have a fourth leg, which is minds, but somehow we didn't get the time to be able to cover that part of it. Maybe we'll leave that for another conversation at some later stage. Thank you so much for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thanks, Ashutosh. Thanks for taking time and talking to me. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.